I'd like to now introduce the speakers. They're going to walk on the stage for today's session entitled Defeating Ransomware, 360-degree review of the RTF 4 years on. I'd like to welcome Megan Stiefel, John Davis, Carol House, Alan Liska, and Michael Phillips.
We almost lost Megan already.
Almost lost it.
All right, Megan, I'm gonna.
Yep. Don't fall off the stage or into the back there. That was cute.
That's one of the things I do.
Well, thanks everyone. You've made it to Thursday, and as I think was just said, it's not just the last session of the afternoon; it's the last session of the conference. So we've saved the best for last, right? Yes. Thank you for coming. We did just hear the names of our panelists, but you should know that this is an esteemed group of people. You heard who they are, so we're going to breeze right past the I'm so-and-so. Please look up their bios, but you should know that they are experts, as you are about to hear. My name is Megan Stiefel. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at the Institute for Security and Technology, and I also serve as the Executive Director of this initiative called the Ransomware Task Force. We didn't have enough space on the slide, so we had to go for RTF. This is an initiative that our organization launched really in the late days of 2020. 4 years ago in 3 days, we published a report that made 48 recommendations about how we could better deter, disrupt, and help organizations prepare for and respond to ransomware. So, what we would like to do this afternoon is talk a little bit about how those 48 recommendations have seen progress or not over the past 4 years, the work that remains to be done, what we succeeded at, and what still leaves many of us with work to do. I should let all of you just say your name and where you're from, I guess. So why don't we do that? Starting with John.
Okay, hello everyone. John Davis. Been at Palo Alto now for not quite, but almost a decade. And before that, 35 years in the US military.
Alan Liska. I'm an intelligence analyst at Recorded Future.
Carol House, a senior fellow at Georgetown, the CyberSmart Center that we have there, and 2 times NSC tour.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for your time. My name is Michael Phillips. I lead the cyber insurance underwriting practice at CFC. CFC is part of Lloyd's of London. We're one of the largest cyber insurers in the world.
Thanks for joining us. So I mentioned that we launched this task force in 2020, late 2020, early 2021, and the way that we structured the work was around those 4 key areas that I just mentioned. How can we help organizations better prepare for and respond to ransomware? How can governments and industry work to disrupt these threat actors, and what measures can be used to deter them? So we had 4 working groups that each had 2 co-chairs. I'm delighted to be joined on the stage by 3 of them, and a few others may stroll in at the back, although I can't see because it's so bright. So we're going to use the Wayback Machine a bit. And take us to the early days, and I want you all to frame yourselves in the mind of Colonial had not yet happened, which I think for many of us was a watershed moment, and think about what the state of ransomware was at that time. And I don't know, Alan, if you wanted to say a few things about kind of where we were at pre-2021.
Bad.
Yes, pre-2020, yeah.
Bad. So certainly ransomware was continuing to grow, but we were seeing the rise of a lot of ransomware as a service groups that were popping up, and it seemed like every week there was a new major attack happening, something big and headline grabbing, et cetera. It still pales into comparison to what we were seeing today, but we were seeing significant year-over-year growth in terms of the number of attacks. Yes, Colonial Pipeline was a big turning point for a lot of people, but the year before, we had seen a ransomware group retaliate because some of their infrastructure had been taken down by knocking out 10 hospitals in a weekend. So they were emboldened, and they felt that they were unstoppable.
Thanks, and it was this rise of the scale and kind of aggressiveness of the threat actors that certainly as we were moving to work from home in the COVID era, led some of us in the organization to think about establishing this ransomware task force. So the next question is really for Michael and John of this Do you know where you were when you learned that we were up to this activity, and like what prompted your organizations to be willing to participate in the effort?
Sure, I'll begin, General Davis, if that's all right, with your permission. So the cyber insurance industry shares the fate of its policyholders. If we're doing our job right, that means that we're paying the losses and seeing the suffering, and hopefully doing more than that. And so the spike in severity that we were seeing, Colonial Pipeline was demonstrative of both the infrastructural threats that we're worried about, but also about the follow-on impact. So our firm underwrites almost 90,000 small and mid-sized businesses, and many of them were worried about, well, what was their, even if it's just their trucking and whether they were going to get gasoline, or if they were they managed gas stations in the northeast, southeast. They had fear about it, and so we ended up seeing more and more of our clients come to us and say, not only am I worried about whether my individual defenses are up to code, but I'm also worried about those risks that I can't control, a third party that I rely upon getting hit and going down. And so, really was excited for us to join and think about how we all work together. The problem had gotten too big for any one organization or even the industry that I serve in.
Yeah, so why did I join? 2 reasons. 1, my boss. Number 2, the CIA. Not that CIA, different one. So I remember exactly where I was, getting ready for Christmas holidays on a Friday afternoon, and my boss calls me up late on a Friday, like he always did. And he said, hey, there's this ransomware task force, and he explained what it was. He said, they've asked for you to be a co-chair by name. And I told him, that's interesting, it sounds like a great thing, but really my plate is kind of full. And he said, maybe you didn't hear me. So I'm a soldier, I know how to take orders. But more importantly, second reason has to do with the CIA. We had been at Palo Alto, like Alan said, we've been watching this problem for a while, all kinds of cyber threats, but this one in particular was, kind of the latest one to raise its head. And I thought to myself, ransomware has finally made the cyber threat real for people. I mean, as CIA, confidentiality, integrity, availability. Traditionally, most of the cyber threats impacted confidentiality, stealing your information for either profit or for intelligence purposes. And that's kind of a hard case to make to a lot of people. But ransomware, so like you said, Alan, affecting hospitals, schools, police stations. These things were very real. Of course, Colonial Pipeline made it extremely real when you couldn't get gas. But this, to me, it was an opportunity to take this one particular aspect of the cyber threat and make it very real for a broad spectrum of people across government, industry, even at a public level, and then do some good things with it. So for those 2 reasons, I accepted, I was voluntold to join, but I accepted the challenge, and that's how I got involved in it.
I was delighted to hear that you were voluntold when we kicked off this process, and so you're hearing that actually it was like December of 2020. I know I was like sitting on the couch and it was December 23rd or something, and Phil Reiner, who's the CEO of our organization, the Institute for Security and Technology, called and said, we're going to do this task force thing. Do you want to join us? And I thought, in a moment of weakness, sure. And for those of you who may have seen prior panels about the ransomware task force, another co-chair, Michael Daniel, who was my boss in the White House previously, says that we then sprinted a marathon. So from about early, like the second week of January through April 28th, we worked fastidiously to come up with these recommendations. At the same time, though, there were things going on in the government. So Carol, you mentioned that you had been at the NSC twice. I just wanted to bring in the government perspective on kind of how was the USG thinking, again, pre-colonial, about ransomware.
It's critical because Colonial was like, it happened a couple months into me coming to the NSC, and really, I came up there from FinCEN. I don't know how many people here know anti-money laundering frameworks. I know everyone loves regulators and regulation, but when it's fighting money launderers and terrorist financiers, I dare you to not like compliance. So I was there running cyber policy and identity policy and cryptocurrency policy, because you can't do cyber-enabled financial crime without covering crypto. Basically, ransomware was a huge issue and priority for us, and so I was brought up to the NSC to help stand up the counter-ransomware work, because we understood that this was it's literally the nexus of cybercrime and financial crime, right? It's cyber-enabled financial extortion. That is the purpose and the means of doing this. Like, you can't deal with one without the other. So I'll say that there's other kinds of cyber-enabled financial crime, right? There's BEC, there's tons of cyber-enabled frauds and scams. All those are certainly concerning to me and to U.S. government and law enforcement authorities, but to certain extents maybe didn't rise to the level of national security threat, even if some of them should, for a lot of reasons, because BEC isn't taking down pipelines, isn't taking down hospitals. Ransomware is. So it's the most pervasive form of disruptive cybercrime that is targeting Americans and taking down critical infrastructure. We understood that, so we understood that we needed to coalesce all these efforts. We saw it as a multi-vector type of issue. It's inherently cyber and financial. It is inherently transnational. Both the money laundering networks or the use of infrastructure, the distributed ransomware as a service economies, all these are transnational. It's public-private. We have state actors and non-state actors that are perpetrators. We're targeting municipalities. We're targeting private sector entities. Just so many different dimensions. It had to be a whole of government approach. So we really started to stand that up in earnest around April. So we had a couple months of really starting to try to formulate those efforts around different lines of efforts. And we had the benefit of the great work that the RTF had done weeks prior to me showing up at the NSC, or maybe while I was there. And so it was really helpful to benefit from the timing of when you guys had brought together your strategic vision. It was really helpful and informative to what we were doing.
We appreciate that. I did not pay her to say that. So I do just wanted to share with you all and kind of spend a couple of minutes talking about something that we all have been saying for a long time when it comes to cybersecurity, which is that and other aspects of technology governance, which is that it is a multi-stakeholder effort. So the way that we did this, as you heard, was to convene these 4 working groups. We had members of industry, some of whom are here on the stage. We had members of government, though not the NSC, but members of a range of law enforcement organizations, both US-based and elsewhere, and of course IST at the time, and still is a nonprofit organization. I was actually in a different nonprofit at the time, and so we had a number of other civil society organizations, as we like to describe ourselves. We also had a few academics, but I wanted to hear, Alan, you were in not the co-chair seat, but the very active participant seat, and wanted to ask you to say a few words about what it was like in the kind of the chaos that we created of sprinting this marathon.
So when I found out that I was not part of the original task force, but when I found out it was coming together, I sent Megan about 300 tweets to get her attention, to say, please, please, please let me join. And it was great because when you hear committee, when you hear task force, you think, oh great, in 3 years we'll get something done and it'll be for things that were a threat that was 2 years ago. And that wasn't what this was. This was people working on the cutting edge of ransomware research, understanding the ransomware threat, and with a mandate to put together actionable steps quickly. And thinking of things, you work for Palo Alto, I work for Recorded Future. Our clients tend to be sort of the higher end clients. We're not necessarily the mom and pop shops, but we're very much taking into consideration, how do we help the small dental office or the small automotive shop? What can we do that's practical at the high level, but also at the low level? And I really appreciated that, because I do think those small and medium-sized businesses are really underserved, and they don't necessarily have the budget to bring in something like Recorded Future or Palo Alto, but they need that protection as much as anybody else. So I love the fact that we were thinking high level, national, international level, national level, state level, big company, medium-sized company, small company, how can they all implement practical protections?
Yes, and John, you were the co-chair of the Prepare Working Group. I don't know if you want to share a bit about how you approached that effort with our friend Jen Ellis, who is...
Yeah. Well, I was Jen's lovely assistant. I'll just tell you right up front, Jen, you're not a co-chair with Jen. Somebody's leading and somebody's following. Jen was leading, and I made it very clear that was fine with me right up front. But and she did a fantastic job. But of these 4 working groups, deter, disrupt, prepare, and respond. In the Prepare working group, I had a particular affection for that just because that's what we do as a company, help organizations prepare, not just respond. And we tried to be as practical, I think, as we could. We tried to give some common sense advice that was practical in a way to do two things. Make organizations aware of the problem and aware of what's available to them. And then number two, I was talking about ransomware impacting availability. Make capabilities and these resources available to organizations to deal with the threat from a preparation perspective. And I thought that was a really good focus. And these functions, deter, disrupt, prepare, respond, they're not isolated. They all, impact each other. The better that you are prepared, the more that you're in a position to offer deterrence. The better that you can, increase your efficiencies in response, that informs disruptive activities, and so they all reinforced each other. The big challenge we had in Prepare, though, was like Alan said, it's the small to medium enterprises. They don't have the resources. So how do you make these things available to them so that not only are they aware of them, but can they get access to them? That was a big challenge. One of the ideas we had was the notion of grants, which I think was, it put a dent in the problem, nowhere near what it needed to do to solve the situation, but I think that helped. So that was kind of a view into the Prepare working group.
Yes, so this nationwide backed awareness campaign was one of our recommendations. But we sort of didn't need it because this is the 28th of April 2021, and so those are some of the headlines from when we launched our report. And then, let's see if I've got this right. Here's a picture of the front of our report. But I think that we were really pleased with the way the journalists responded to our effort, and yet still we all sort of worried, many of us having come out of government, to your point, Alan, like, oh, is it going to take too long to write it, or is it going to be written and no one's going to pay attention to it? But we didn't have to worry about that too much because, as I noted a minute ago, on the 7th of May, 2021, Colonial Pipeline gets hit by ransomware. We're not going to spend time talking about that incident. I think everyone now knows and should remember that the hackers did not shut down the pipeline. The pipeline was shut down because there was an accounting issue, and it was the enterprise that was hit. But like a few days after that, we had a meatpacking industry also hit. So this idea of like, let's get the attention to ransomware, the nationwide back campaign was not one that we had to take care of ourselves. It had sort of been taken care of for us. I did want to just spend a minute, though. We sort of alluded to the idea that Colonial was a watershed moment. And so maybe I'll turn to Carol first and then to the others to say kind of how did you in government respond to this, and kind of can you give us an insight, obviously not going too far, it being deliberative work, but pre-decisional, but
Yeah.
What was the conversation like?
Yeah, honestly, like at the beginning of any of those efforts, there's of course some tensions that we're trying to do, like why ransomware and not other kinds of cyber threats, like the issue of that ransomware, like some people thought it was a buzzword, like this was not, obviously there was a much greater consensus that was not the case, because like why this particular threat? And really it was around the disruptive nature, like that's why it's so special and horrific in its implications and devastating in its impact on companies and people at times. Because like honestly, current transitions I think towards just data extortion, I'm curious to see how that, if you take disruption out of it, how much it stays at the top line of priorities. But it was, because it was, disruption fueled extortion. And then also it had always been a law enforcement problem, right? It's cyber crime. So like law enforcement knew the most about this, and we have amazing law enforcement agencies, exquisite capabilities, absolutely amazing people focusing on this, but like it had always been law enforcement led primary and not like a broader national security apparatus and hat that we put on to look at a fulsome view of how to attack and leverage the levers on both the financial and the cyber and infrastructure side, because both of these are vulnerabilities that are being exploited, as well as levers for disruption that we could use. So I think that like moments like Colonial were really helpful to elevate it, to make use of that crisis to help highlight that like this is why we must prioritize this. But yeah, I think like that really helped us move through some of those obstacles to really get that whole of government, at least vision. Operationalizing it, of course, takes time, and we still have an issue with pace of disruption.
Yes, and I skipped ahead by accident. So the 5th of May, so taking you all back, Cinco de Mayo, John and I and Chris Krebs had the pleasure of testifying, so 2 days before Colonial, on ransomware. And John, so I kind of want to think about, between the time of the report's launch, maybe you want to talk a little bit about how not so much our hearing, which I think was great, but it was virtual, and we were pleased to see that Congress was already focused on the issue ahead of Colonial. But how did Palo Alto kind of respond to the Colonial and the ensuing major incidents? Did it change your approach at all?
Well, like I said, we have been dealing with all kinds of cyber threats. We were a cybersecurity company for a long time. Ransomware this wasn't a immediately recent thing. We'd been dealing with this also. But the thing that I noticed that changed with Colonial Pipeline, because of the sense of urgency that was coming out of government-led things, as well as our report, I think, helped everybody recognize this was going to take, there's no one silver bullet that's going to fix this. It's going to take a bunch of tasks across a bunch of functions and a bunch of organizations on a sustained campaign to make it happen. But the big change that I noticed was, whereas the ransomware problem in particular, just looking from a customer perspective, prior to this was largely a respond issue. Once you have a problem, how do you deal with it, et cetera. This moved it more into the prepare. This, you better get ready, because if you haven't dealt with this, you're probably going to be dealing with this. So from a company perspective, we moved a lot of effort into, preparatory activities, advisory activities, these type of things, in intelligence sharing, intelligence advisories that moved organizations that were, now ready to talk about how do we make sure we're ready for this thing, rather than let's just make sure we can deal with it after the event. That was the big change.
So, Michael, I want to pull you in as
sure.
the counselor, the insurer. How did the insurance industry, do you think, respond to Colonial?
Well, I think the first thing to say is the major message of our talk today, which is ransomware is too big for anyone to deal with alone. So the Colonial Pipeline event, from an insurance perspective, was a symptom of something that was already going on, which is the extraordinary spike in ransomware events. But what we saw with it was the secondary effects, all the folks who relied on Colonial Pipeline. One thing I think is important for all of us to think about, RSA as a community does a great job of this, and the Ransomware Task Force does as well, is working to destigmatize the victim's experience. And so Colonial Pipeline is perhaps the most famous victim of a ransomware attack in the world. It certainly got a new level of notoriety. Their executives were, asked questions about the decision making that they made. For the cyber insurance industry, what I think the Colonial Pipeline really put a spotlight on is how do we help influence and order decision making, both earlier in the life cycle, as General Davis was just talking about. How do we help our clients prepare? How do we structure their response? What do we do to influence the right decision at the right time? And so since then, I think we've made a lot of progress, but it really did put scrutiny on the insurance market as well, and how do we help our clients.
We're going to get to some of that too in a minute. But Alan, how about kind of from your seat at Recorded Future, was this a immediate change or kind of more of the same, but more foot on the gas?
Almost got me divorced. So Colonial Pipeline happened the weekend that my stepdaughter graduated from medical school, and I was under strict orders, no computers, no work, because this is my wife's big day. Her daughter is graduating from medical school. Around 8 a.m. on Saturday, as we're getting ready, I get a call from a friend at CISA. Hey, what do you know about Black Matter, I think was the name of the ransomware group, I forget now, it's been so long. And I'm like, uh-oh. So yeah, I pull everything that I have, send it over to him. Then like a half hour later, I get a call from a buddy at the FBI. Hey, what do you know about Black Matter ransomware? And so I start to figure it out. And then the calls from the reporters start coming in. Hey, I'm hearing from people at CISA and FBI about this Black Matter group, and maybe that's involved in Colonial Pipeline, and I'm like, great. And then finally, our CEO calls and say, hey, got somebody from the White House, and they want to know about Black Matter ransomware group. Do we have anything on them? I'm like, yes, we have everything on them. Here you go. So by the time we got to the ceremony, my wife was just a little unhappy with me because, it was just, me constantly responding to people on the phone. But I mean, to me, because I had been working in ransomware so much, I was already used to this kind of intel sharing, but it was nice to do it in a more formalized environment, instead of, I think of it as like a small town in New Jersey where, everything worked prior to it by I know a guy. So if you know a guy, then you call that guy at that organization and so on. But if you don't know any guys, then it's really hard to do that intel sharing. One of the things that I think the Ransomware Task Force and Colonial Pipeline help is create more formalized avenues for intel sharing, and I think that's really important because we're all trying to solve the problem. Like, everybody knows me as the ransomware sommelier. I hope in 5 years that people look at that title and go, why would you still have that title? Like, I want it to be obsolete, and the only way that we're going to do that is by sharing our intel with each other.
Well, so we're gonna transition from kind of the things that we had hoped for into and recommended, and to see about progress. And Ellen, I'm curious. I'm pleased, but also curious to hear more on. We're going to come to this in a minute. Kind of, how much progress have we really made when it comes to threat intel sharing? So every year, the Institute for Security and Technology and our wonderful team, Taylor's here in the front of the audience, and I can't see if anybody else is here. But I don't think we have anybody else here except for Josh is here. Over here, have worked to track progress against these 48 recommendations that we made. And we didn't do it this year because somebody decided to schedule a security conference, and who's going to read a report that gets launched this week? But we also actually think that we're frozen, so I'm bringing the bottom line up front here. We have seen, we assess not a highly scientific process, but a thorough process, about 50% progress, significant progress on 50% of the recommendations. The unfortunate part is that 8% of them have seen known action. And so one of the pieces where we think that we haven't seen action, which we may not, is this area around an IC assessment of ransomware gangs, which might then, when shared with industry, could bring some more sustainable and lasting disruptive measures. We have seen, though, things like the Joint Ransomware Task Force, which became law. We have seen CERCIA. One of the recommendations that the task force called for was incident reporting and payment reporting, and so we now saw CERCIA be passed into law in 2022. Of course, in the fall of 2021, the White House stood up the Counter Ransomware Initiative, which was terrific, and the following year, some of us got to join the second Counter Ransomware Initiative meeting in 2022. We also developed a cyber incident reporting framework and published that in the 2022-2023 timeframe, and have updated it to a global edition. We call this the SURF Global Edition. Looking, of course, at one thing in particular, which will hopefully make all of our industry friends in the audience happy: regulatory harmonization. But again, we've made some progress, but we're not quite there yet. One of the things that we also did was to look at the payment ecosystem. And sorry to play narrator here for a little bit, but I'm going to try and keep us on time. And the idea around this map that you see, you can see it in the background, is to map by entity type. So we didn't name any names, we named types of organizations. Are they CSPs? Are they blockchain analytic firms? Are they financial services institutions? How do they sit and how do they see ransomware payments? And through this map, can we then identify points of concentration where a particular action at that point could disrupt a payment? In thinking about that, though, we also wanted to make sure that when these decisions to disrupt payments and seize payments were made, that the victims had a say. Because the thing you don't want to do is to seize a payment and then have the victim not get their data back. Of course, this was also a different era of as Carol was saying, the evolution of the threat actors. I will also note a couple of other things that were launched around that we did see progress on, which is the vulnerability warning pilot that CISA runs and hopefully will keep running. At the same time, though, payments kept growing. So, Carol, how would you say that the payments process and kind of how has the USG evolved its approach to looking at ransomware payments? And
yeah. So at least the best thing that came out of that was just really acknowledging the financial side as a really critical lever for us to be able to build out. So prioritizing the capabilities of, again, the great investigators that work across the government as well as like industry firms like the blockchain analytics firms and other investigators to be able to follow the analytics trails. I don't know how many people in here are really familiar with cryptocurrency, but like Cash and Fedwire and Swift do not publish to public ledgers. Cryptocurrency does. I don't know why all these criminals are publishing their transactions on public ledgers. I hope they do it forever. But like that is, it's very useful, at least in the traceability side. Now, seizing it is a different story because there's the insertion points of our ability to actually get and gain the funds relies on a lot of things like implementation of compliance frameworks in the cryptocurrency sector, not something that has been adopted at scale at all, and certainly not across many jurisdictions. If you guys, I don't know if you're familiar with the FATF, it's the Financial Action Task Force, kind of the UN for anti-money laundering, or the ISO for anti-money laundering. We passed the first ever standards for virtual assets in 2019 that require things like know your customer requirements and to have programs to reasonably detect and prevent money laundering, like for illicit proceeds from cyber-enabled extortion. But most jurisdictions have still not implemented those well. So we really focused and prioritized on, as much as possible, trying to elevate that issue. We did at the FATF, supporting training through INL, also other things using money like Rewards for Justice and the Talk Rewards program. And then we did tons of designations and use of even authorities at FinCEN, primary money laundering concerned designations, had never scaled anything to that extent. There were also some public-private partnerships that were stood up. They've been slow to stand up and operationalize, but things like the Illicit Virtual Asset Notification, or IVAN partnership, that the NCI-JTF runs with MITRE, and then also even work on the industry side, where like we've seen the crypto industry has arisen to different ISACs, trying to focus on tracing illicit proceeds in crypto, and even like Georgetown has a standards effort that they're doing to try to do like what Oasis does with Taxi and Styx for illicit crypto proceeds, to try to make sure that you can, if it's cyber money, you need to be able to trace it and share information at the speed of the internet. So all those are efforts that have been underway. So there's still a lot of room for actual adoption and implementation, but there are at least a lot of irons in the fire.
Great. Well, we do, for those of you who may remember back to Colonial, they worked closely after a couple of minutes with government, maybe a couple days, a couple of phone calls. And actually, much of the proceeds of the payment were seized, but this is me and my former U.S. government voice talking and saying, it's really important to work with the government because you might actually get some of your money back as opposed to kind of going it alone. But yet we still see ransomware as continuing to climb. Most recently, right, IC3 reported a number that I think many of us think is a drastic undercount, but those are folks coming voluntarily forward or at the gentle counsel of their lawyers, coming forward and reporting ransomware as an incident. Alan, since I know you are the ransomware sommelier, how have you seen the arc of ransomware shift over the past 4 years?
So it's interesting, a couple of things. Like last year for the first time, I think we did see the number of not the number of payments, but the amount paid going down, which is a good sign, even though the number of ransomware attacks were up. And we're seeing that trend continue into 2025, where the number of ransomware attacks, you mentioned the IC3 report, according to them, they're up 9%. That's in line with what we're seeing in terms of reporting. So number of ransomware attacks are up, still number of not the number of payments, but the amount of payments are down. One of the things that's been really interesting, and you touched on this, with the advent of more data theft only attacks without encryption, in the first quarter we saw about 50% of the attacks that we saw were data theft only. And one of the weirdest things that's led to is ransomware actors complaining that they can't get any attention for their attacks anymore. I've had several reporters tell me that they got just super angry emails from CLOP because they weren't reporting on the Clio breaches the way they had reported on past breaches. In part because nobody cares, right? There's so much data being leaked that it's hard to get attention. And honestly, I think that does contribute to it, because one of the reasons that ransomware has been so successful is it's one of the few cybercrimes out there that has essentially its own PR arm, where it gets attention in the news, it gets on the nightly news or in the paper or whatever. And we know ransomware actors would like collect clips effectively of their news things, and they would brag about it in their in their forums and chats and so on. So I do think that that's a big part of it, but also all of the law enforcement action, which again has been very cooperative. There were 40 different. At least 40 different ransomware or ransomware adjacent law enforcement actions last year. And that is a big disruptor into that system. So I think that also plays into it.
Great. Yes, the disruptions have gone up, which is we think is a terrific thing. We'd love to see that continue. Michael, and we're going to come to the potential solutions. I'm looking at Alan in particular because we've had conversations about drone strikes from time to time. We're coming there.
I won't say drone today, I promise.
It's okay. We have not totally picked on the insurance sector yet, but many of us who've been following this issue being ransomware over the past several years, know that there are policymakers who think that insurers and negotiators are the root of all evil. That you are enabling this crime spree to continue. I'm going to keep going. So I'm not necessarily asking you to defend the sector, but where can you? Some people may know if you follow insurance quite closely. We've had hard markets and soft markets. So where were we and where are we at, and what's happening next?
So I'll do a series of then and nows.
Yeah.
But you mentioned the market cycle, so I will say every type of insurance typically has a market cycle of hard markets, meaning, we've underwritten poorly, we are paying lots of losses, we don't know what the risk management standard is for the problem that we're solving for, and then the price goes up and the standards goes up, and hopefully we figure that out. But if we figure that out, that means the insurance market is going really well and it's a supply and demand thing, and then everyone comes in and they trim those standards or they trim the prices, and then next thing you know, you're paying losses you can't sustain any longer. So ransomware, certainly in 2019, was driving losses up, which means, of course, in many good ways for all of you who might be buyers of insurance, that means the insurance market was paying losses. But of course, that means that we were suffering as both individual businesses and the pool that is insurance, so much ransomware loss, that it triggered a hard market and the rising of standards. So quick thens and nows. First of all, then and now, it's true that most organizations still don't buy cyber insurance. And of course, you can find me out back if you would like some, and I will sell you some.
Click for coverage.
Yes, that's right. But then in 2019, 2020, I think of those clients who were buying cyber insurance, most victims did not want to contact law enforcement. So again, just coming back to what we've been talking about destigmatizing the victim's experience, and of this being all of our problems, then most of our victims would not report to law enforcement unless we made them. Because they were worried about the regulatory or the law enforcement onus turning on them as victims, regardless of whether they ultimately decide to pay or not, but of course if they did decide to pay. Now, most insurers require law enforcement reporting, but most victims have a much higher trust level, and I think that's been a testament to the RSA community and of course to the task force. We've had more interaction between law enforcement and private sector before something bad happens. Again, as General Davis put it, we've shifted it to the left to the prepare stage. And then I suppose the last then and now is that cyber insurers have certainly asked themselves many pointed questions about how does what we structure in what we cover, in what we ask for as a standard of underwriting to offer insurance in the first place, how that might shape the destiny of the outcome of a cybercrime event like ransomware. And what you're seeing is more transparency from the insurance market, both amongst the players in that market and with the public. So more insurers are publishing statistics about how many of their victims choose to pay, what points of failure led to the ransomware event happening in the first place. If you did rewind the clock to as we were working on the ransomware task force, you would have found that type of information was really the trade secret advantage for an insurance company.
Yeah.
If you know how the bad thing happens, then and you think you know that uniquely, then your private sector motivation might be to hold that for yourself. But what we were seeing as a result of the turn in the market, and of course, speaking as a citizen, all of my communities under threat, my infrastructure under threat, my businesses, my neighbors, we realized there was a bigger problem. And so you're starting to see more publishing of data and exchange of information with government.
Which I think is also something that we called for in the task force report. So progress there. John, how about, I'm going to turn to you. This is going to be kind of a question for each of you of where do you think we've not come very far? And then I think we're going to, the second phase of that, or second part of that question is what would you ask of the U.S. government, the new administration, or another government to do? So two-parter.
Well, I mean, as you showed on the pie chart, there's still a long way to go. And even those things that the RTF report had made progress on, I get a sense that some of them are losing steam.
Yep.
So I would ask the government, I would ask the U.S. government at least, and I don't know it would be any different from any of our partners, don't lose focus. I mean, don't lose focus on this. This, cyber in general, ransomware in particular, has traditionally been one of those things that has been bipartisan, sometimes even nonpartisan. And so my hope is that we won't lose focus and that we'll keep the pressure on, because this is certainly deserving of the pressure. The other thing I would say that's kind of related to that is if you look at the threats in general, nation state versus non-nation state, we're slowly erasing the versus. They're working together. And it's very clear in the ransomware issue, they're working together. Because nation states, they either turn a blind eye to this, in some cases they inspire it, and in other cases they covertly support this when the interests are aligned and it's to the benefit of the nation state. This is a national security issue. It's an economic issue, it's a public health and safety issue, but it's a national security issue, and I would, my request would be don't forget that from a government perspective.
Couldn't agree more. How about Ellen? How about
Yeah, so I do think that we're hitting a bit of ransomware fatigue, and I get it. People are tired of hearing about ransomware. I've been hearing about ransomware forever. I'm tired of talking about ransomware. But we have 3 retail chains in the UK that are out this week because of a ransomware attack, and there may be a couple more coming. And so it's still a very real problem. Some of the ransomware actors are extremely sophisticated. They've been doing this for 15 years now, starting all the way back in 2009 with the early ransomware groups. Those people are still there, and they've continued to evolve. So I like not just what we've done with the Ransomware Task Force, but also the Global Ransomware Task Force. That intel sharing has been really important, and that's led to a lot of the successes we have, but we still have a long way to go. Things I'd like to see that continued law enforcement activity. I'd like to see more actions against cryptocurrency exchanges, cryptocurrency mixers in particular. I think that's a big one, going after the money. Yes, I'd love drone strikes, but I realize that that's probably not practical. But I mean, do you all know the story of how we caught the guy that had that was behind Raccoon Stealer?
no?
Okay, so guy that was behind Raccoon Stealer, which is an info stealer, very famous, very big info stealer, had at one point like 10% of the market, and he, when Putin decided to invade Ukraine, he decided he wanted to leave. So he left and went to Poland, and he brought his Instagram model girlfriend with him. And we know that she was an Instagram model because she posted their exodus all the way down, obviously not naming him, but because law enforcement knew who all of his associates were and were tracking her Instagram account. As soon as they took this, it's a wonderful picture. You can find it in his, because he's under trial now in Arizona, you can find it in the evidence that was submitted of them just having a perfectly lovely time starting their new life in Warsaw. So if we're not going to drone strike, maybe if we could get more of the ransomware actors' Instagram model girlfriends or boyfriends and just track their activities so when they leave Russia, we can pick them up. That would be wonderful.
support that as well.
Yeah, well, I appreciate creative thinking, non-cyber solutions, cyber problems. I'll say on my front, I'll double down on certainly what General Davis said about the international work. The CRI needs to be continued, the CRI fund, so the counter-ransomware initiative efforts need to continue, like that momentum needs to grow and needs to be more operationalized and continued. And whether it's through diplomatic levers, through sanctions and economic levers, through implementation of the Cybercrime Convention at the FATF, whatever, like the jurisdictions that are behind this, like most of these guys are Russian, and like we absolutely need to continue to keep up the pressure. We need sustained disruption operations that leverage lots of different levers. It's tough when you've got like law enforcement that really knows this stuff best. Law enforcement levers are often the most enduring impact because you get somebody out of the battle space. They're also some of the longest tails to actually be able to achieve them. So it's a mix of different levers that we need to figure out how to bring that sustained pressure operation. And then on the financial side, absolutely. Like we just disbanded the National Crypto Enforcement Team, and like a lot of other things that I'm worried about, that even though I'm happy about certain regulatory efforts that are potentially going to happen, if they're not enforced, then policy that's not enforced is useless and feckless, and we need more enforcement here.
Governments, what would you like them to do?
What I'd like government to do, I think first is to continue to destigmatize the victim's experience. And the reason I say that is I still think there's a lot of ambiguity around, almost like the political economy of whose fault is it, who's responsible for it, what is the individual organization responsible for, what can they contract out into an insurance pool, for instance, or what do they expect to externalize into the public. When you look at small and mid-sized businesses, they are not generating the kinds of margins that they're able to invest in all of the latest and greatest. So it's what kind of targeted investments can they make? And I think government has a role to play in helping them make those targeted investments. But no security is perfect. So then what do we do about it? And what do we expect them to do about it if they fall victim? So to me, it's, again, pushing our interventions earlier in the timeline.
And how about industry? Does anybody want to chime in on the industry? What can industry do in this space?
Yeah, I'll take it. Look at the threats, and you can see not just ransomware, but all of them are increasing their speed, their scale, and their sophistication. What industry needs to do is outmaneuver that by increasing its speed, its scale, and by simplifying things. And I think there's a lot of positive progress. You probably heard a lot about that out here this week. I know we've focused on this issue of trying to leverage automation in much more powerful ways, leverage advanced software analytics like machine learning and generative AI and behavior analytics, all these capabilities. These, you need to fight machines with machines, you need to fight software with software, and these are largely machine and software-based threats. And on the simplicity side, the idea of beginning to, people are drowning in alerts dealing with this, they're drowning in the management of various kinds of tools and capabilities. Industry needs to simplify that for organizations, especially the smaller ones. And I think that one of the spin-offs of the Ransomware Task Force was a blueprint for defense, working with the Center for Internet Security and looking at about, I think it was roughly 36 things that are the most effective things that you can do against ransomware in particular, and the easiest to do, and in many cases, the cheapest or no cost. These are things for small and medium enterprises that they can do to really put a dent in this problem. So, and one other thing, the other thing that really supercharged industry involvement following Colonial Pipeline was industry participation at a larger scale in intelligence sharing with government organizations and support to operational disruption. Not by, doing offensive things, that's not the job of industry in my view, but by exposing things. You can burn an adversary's infrastructure simply by putting it out there publicly. And sometimes when government and industry get together, industry's in a better position to do that than government. So these are all things that industry can do that I think would be very helpful.
Others?
I think one of the things that definitely would help is more transparency. Like there was a recent breach at an unnamed database company named after a lady who used to live in Delphi, and it took weeks to understand exactly what happened. And you're leaving that exposure, as you say, they move much faster. Like the adversaries move much faster. We see now a new vulnerability announced, and within 24 hours we see scanning. Within 48 hours we see exploitation of it. So, and I know exploitation is just one way the bad guys get access, but that transparency in vulnerability management helps people be able to patch faster. Making it easier to make more secure operating systems, configuring Microsoft Active Directory so that it's secure can be a challenge. Making it easier to do that, simplifying that process is something that needs to be done. And to your point, making less complex networks. The more complex the network is, the easier it is for a bad guy to slip through. And unfortunately, just more training. Phishing is still a big problem, leaked credentials still a big problem, et cetera. More training on how to better improve, and I know this sounds self-serving coming from a comic book guy, but improve people's spidey sense so that everybody is kind of out there working toward a better security.
Yeah, on the cyber side, implementation of phishing-resistant MFA, just like the use of valid credentials being like a major vector point. And then on the crypto side, I'm going to keep harping on this. I need the cryptocurrency industry to self-police. Like if we're going to lower enforcement for the next couple of years, which I hope isn't the case, but maybe, then the industry needs to self-police. Like we can totally solve this. The cryptocurrency industry does not. Like the responsible actors in it do not want to be the ones that are like enabling the kind of stuff that's currently absolutely allowed to scale. Like you wouldn't have ransomware at the scale that it is today if they were reliant on gift cards and wire transfers. Like I know tons of other frauds and stuff use TradFi, but ransomware is different because anyway, that it's illicit when it's happening, so it wouldn't work in the same way and to the same scale. So they really need to police. I love the work that groups like Begin, like the Blockchain Governance Initiative, are doing because they need standards. Like the industry has not adopted and implemented standards, and they're not sharing this illicit information with each other on illicit funds, and they really could. And they need the expertise also of those from this community, from the cybersecurity community. There's no PCI DSS for the for the crypto community, like most of them don't. Like decentralized communities have a hard time organizing, and most of them haven't really been prioritizing standards. So they need the expertise of the people sitting in this room.
Last word, Michael.
I like that. She nailed it. I think the experience of the ransomware task force is certainly that civil society and the private sector have to get involved and integrate their conversation with government. Our public policy is only going to be as good as the inputs that it has, and this room has so much expertise in it, and it can't be shy, because conversations about this problem are happening at the local, state, federal, and international level.
Yeah. Well, you just made, I think, a plug for the Ransomware Task Force work to keep going.
Yes.
We will be keeping going, and I know we've kept you longer than our time allotted. So thanks, everyone, for your attention this afternoon. I think folks can stick around for questions, which we didn't get a chance to get to. But at IST, the Institute for Security and Technology, we're going to keep after this question, and we're really thinking about, you mentioned potentially decreased regulation, but also a push to state and locals. So we'll be really looking at that question of how can we better help these organizations be prepared, but also looking at the incentives that continue to drive these threat actors to keep acting, and also how can we incentivize better preparation. So if you are interested in any of our work, feel free to check out the website. Here is the apply slide. If you haven't been thinking about ransomware, you should be, because it is everywhere. And so we definitely would encourage you to take a look at stopransomware.gov. There are other resources out there, of course. And think about how collaboration can best be achieved through your individual pursuits as well as your organization's pursuits. And don't give up the ship. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our panelists. Don't forget to take the survey and have a good rest of the day. Thank you.